It's you. Welcome to Planet America's Weekend Edition. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello.
This week, an update for you on the Epstein files, and following those somewhat exaggerated reports of Donald Trump's demise this week, we'll look at the American president who hid his incapacity for almost 2 years and speak to an expert on the way that a president can be removed if they're not up to the job.
And Trump's tariffs are on the ropes. Are we going to miss them when they're gone? But first...
The US Congress was back in session this week, and not coincidentally, the Epstein scandal was back in the news. Democrats and a handful of Republicans are pushing ahead with what they're calling the Epstein Files Transparency Act, which calls on the US Justice Department to release any and all documents and other evidence relating to the crimes of the late convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein.
So we gather here on the steps of the Capitol to confront these corrupt forces. Today we stand with survivors, we stand against big money, we stand to protect America's children. That is really what this is about.
Democrats headed by California Congressman Ro Khanna have teamed up with Republicans, including Thomas Massie, a frequent thorn in the president's side, and some less likely Trump antagonists, including Congresswoman Nancy Mace, Lauren Boebert, and the mega MAGA Marjorie Taylor Greene to push this bill. The group cannot get a vote on this bill, though, in the House unless Speaker Mike Johnson allows it, which he is not inclined to do over the wishes of the president, or until they can get a majority in the House to sign up to a so-called discharge petition, which is still not guaranteed to progress. Some of the survivors of Epstein's crimes, though, have added their support to the bill, including Anushka DeGiorgio, who had this message.
If Ghislaine Maxwell were pardoned, it would undermine all the sacrifices I made to testify and make mockery of mine and all survivors' suffering. That is why the Epstein Files Transparency Act is so essential. It requires the Department of Justice release all the records related to Epstein and Maxwell investigations, flight logs, immunity deals, internal communications, and even the records surrounding Epstein's detention and death.
Well, the Justice Department did release around 30,000 pages of documents relating to Epstein this week, including some flight logs, but the vast majority of these documents were already in the public domain, and none of it comes close to the kind of information about Epstein's associates that the survivors are demanding. The Justice Department and even Ghislaine Maxwell have said there is no client list, but Epstein's victims say that they will compile a list of the men that they were trafficked to for sex. And Marjorie Taylor Greene says that she will make that list public by reading it onto the congressional record.
I'm not afraid to name names. And so if they want to give me a list, I will walk in that Capitol on the House floor and I'll say every damn name that abused these women. I can do that for them, and I'd be proud to do it.
This is a fascinating development, Chaz. On the one hand, they're to be applauded for putting the victim survivors front and centre in all of this, reminding people this isn't about scuttlebutt or conspiracy theories. This is about real crimes against real people. It also defangs the Trump administration's main defence against releasing these documents, which has been it will tend to identify the victims, and they've already been victimised enough. The victims are now saying, we want this out there, and in fact, we are going to put it out there by compiling this client list. Marjorie Taylor Greene going to put it on the congressional record. Thomas Massie is going to help in that. But of course, these are now untested allegations that there will be questions about whether this is fair to the people who are named, because there has been no due process in all of this. So this is a really intriguing development.
I agree. Can I also say, I don't know what's happened to Marjorie Taylor Greene. In the last year, she's evolving into Trump's biggest nightmare. She is behind every single headache of Trump's over the last 4 or 5 months, which is really strange development from her. I don't know what she's playing at, but it's certainly a tactic.
And she has obviously a long history of peddling and believing in all sorts of wacky conspiracy theories. This is Marjorie Jewish Space Laser Greene. So an interesting move for Ro Khanna, who is a very serious individual, a potential 2028 Democratic presidential candidate for the progressive wing that Bernie Sanders has been the standard bearer for, that he is now prepared to team up with not just Marjorie Taylor Greene, but Lauren Boebert, who's, you know, in that kind of clown car in the minds of many, as Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Nancy Mace, who herself is a victim survivor of sexual abuse in the military, but she's also said and done some pretty wacky things as well. So this is a really interesting coalition, but I guess they're prepared to work with anyone right now who's going to give them a vote in the House to maybe get this discharge petition forward.
Yeah, I wouldn't be necessarily rely on Nancy Mace's vote. She has signed the petition. She says she's going to sign the petition, but she's also Trump's biggest defender. So we'll see if she sticks by it. At the moment, Anna Paulina Luna has also said that she is likely to sign that. That means they need one more Republican, assuming all the Democrats support it. So that's getting very close. At the same time, Mike Johnson has a phony bill, which they can use as cover if Republicans use as cover if they don't want to support the discharge petition. And Trump has put out that he will construe it as a hostile vote against him if you vote for the discharge petition, which is interesting because it actually won't do anything. If they vote for that discharge petition, I mean, it sounds wonderful to say they'll release the Epstein files, but it's got to get through the Senate and Trump. The Senate aren't even going to listen to that bill. They're not even going to put it up. And even if they did, do you think Trump's going to sign it? So really, this is just a symbolic gesture. I mean, it means a lot to the House guys who have to vote, but it's not going to make any difference to the actual Epstein case.
And politically it's a wedge because it forces those who are opposed to the release of the Epstein files to go on the congressional record themselves as opposing the release of this information, which the victim survivors are now advocating publicly for. So that's potentially putting them in an awkward position, whether this gets tied to debt ceiling negotiations and other things that are coming down the pike as well. That's going to be interesting to see. And at some point, of course, if Donald Trump is not named in this and he isn't feeling particularly loyal to some of his long-term business associates who some of the court filings have suggested have been named, so this could be Trump's loyalty, but there'll be limits on Trump's loyalty. If he's taking too much political damage from all of this, too much heat from his base, then he might just say, you know what, here it is, few redactions, we've left the name of the Democrats in though, so go for your life.
Yeah, can I just make very clear, Trump is not going to be named. Like, we know that for a fact. That's not me being conspiracy theorist.
He's not been named in any public filings so far, and he has not been publicly accused by any of Epstein's victims.
Yeah. Now, accusations are another thing altogether. But in terms of the files, the Epstein files, we know for a fact, we've been told that freedom of information laws have redacted Trump's name from the files. So even if they release the entirety of the 100,000 pages, Trump's name would not appear once.
Right.
We know that for a fact. Okay, so don't be expecting Trump to turn up in the Epstein files. I do think they released those 30,000 pages of documents to distract from, to try and take steal some of the thunder from the discharge petition from the survivors. I don't think it worked. The fact that 97% of the files were already released and the stuff that weren't already released were redacted.
But this wasn't just documents as well. We got an extra second of video that was pretty important.
An extra minute. We got that missing minute, the missing minute from the original Epstein prison video,
right,
which Pam Bondi assured us is in every single Department of Justice video.
So just to recap, this is the surveillance footage from outside Jeffrey Epstein's cell in 2019 on the night that he ended his own life.
That's right.
And when this video was released earlier in the year, there was a missing minute, which some metadata analysts said actually is a missing 8 minutes.
That's right.
So, what do we now know?
Well, what we now know, Pam Bondi at the time said, well, but at 11:59 every single night they reset the video on every prison video in the block. Well, they re-released the video with that minute there, which means she lied.
Oops.
So we don't know anything more about Epstein. It's not like that minute had anything valuable.
Right.
But we do know that Pam Bondi's a liar.
Right.
That much we do know. Look, there's a bit of Groundhog Day about this where we just keep on going, well, they haven't released anything. But I think there is a game changer here from the survivors. They are a new element. And they didn't, until now, they were keeping to themselves. They were scared to come out. Now they're being forced out into the public. Well, there's no reason for them to go back into private anymore, is there? So you can expect them to stay in public. And I think they're they're really going to scramble things. I think that this story is not going away at all now that they're out.
Yeah, I mean, think back to our history, the most famous occasion where something was read onto the congressional record to overcome legal barriers to it being published was the Pentagon Papers that lifted the lid on the lies the American people were told by successive presidential administrations about the war in Vietnam. That was read onto the congressional record, so it could then be published. So it provides a legal loophole for these names of the alleged clients to come out. Now, speaking of this sort of grey area in between what we know to be true and what we know to be a conspiracy theory and wishful thinking and so on. This week, America celebrated the Labor Day holiday, marking the end of summer, when traditionally the linen suits and Panama hats of the well-heeled are packed away and the beach house on the Cape is bolted until the next season. And it does mark one last long weekend before the return to school and work. An opportunity too for a hard-working American president to unwind for a few days away from the media glare. So, how did that work out?
Suddenly, timelines across X, Facebook and TikTok were flooded with one shocking phrase: Donald Trump dead. The trend gripped millions, triggering panic, confusion and a wave of conspiracy chatter.
And there was all sorts of evidence to support this rumour as it spread around the world. Pictures of Trump's bruised hands and cankles. This seemingly innocuous comment from Vice President J.D. Vance seemed to some like prescience from President Vance.
Yes, things can always happen. Yes, terrible tragedies happen. But I feel very confident the President of the United States is in good shape, is going to serve out the remainder of his term and do great things for the American people. And if, God forbid, there's a terrible tragedy, I can't think of better on-the-job training than what I've gotten over the last 200 days.
Meanwhile, Trump's Truth Social account declared he'd never felt better in his life, which some thought it was exactly what you'd expect somebody to post if they had died. And while the internet speculated wildly and other media speculated on the internet speculation...
Speculation swirled online about President Donald Trump's health after he stayed out of public view for several days. There were even rumours that he died.
And the late-night comedians joked about it. Even former vice presidential candidate Tim Walz tried to make light of it while seeming to let slip that he was quite looking forward to Trump's actual departure from this mortal coil.
Look, I get it. You get up in the morning and you doom scroll through things, and although I will say this, the last few days you woke up thinking there might be news. Just saying. There will be news sometime, just so you know, there will be news.
Donald Trump will never die. Forget it. He's like Dracula. He's going to keep sucking the life out of us forever.
The biggest story was frenzied social media rumors speculating whether Donald Trump had died. For the record, Donald Trump is very much alive, okay? And no... We like our presidents alive.
And despite some apparently new pictures of an apparently not dead President Trump being posted, it actually took the man himself to front the cameras on Tuesday to dispel the reports of his demise, which he claimed not to actually know about.
I didn't hear that one. That's pretty serious stuff. Well, it's fake news. You know, it's just so fake. That's why the media has so little credibility. I knew they were saying, like, is he okay? How's he feeling? What's wrong? I said, I just left. And it's also sort of a longer weekend, you know. It's Labor Day weekend, so I would say a lot of people know. I was very active this Labor Day.
But once again, like his denials about Jeffrey Epstein, Trump is running headlong into a credibility problem of his own making. The White House lied about the seriousness of his COVID in 2020. He lied about his own weight, his own height, his own general health. He famously wrote his own doctor's letter, Harold Bornstein valet. And so he's now trying to flip the script to make this about the media's credibility, when it was social media, not broadcast or mainstream media, which did the speculating. J.D. Vance then made an inadvertently good point when he tweeted out, if the media you consume told you that Donald Trump was on his deathbed because he didn't do a press conference for 3 days, imagine what else they're lying to you about. Well, quite, because the media did not say that Trump was dying. It was a bunch of TikTokers and social media stirrers who were doing that. And you could argue that journalists reporting on the fact that this was being said is a little bit like journalists reporting on a protest or any other thing that people do in the world that might be of interest to other people. But there was nobody that I saw in the media who was saying, apparently Trump's dead.
Yeah, I agree. I thought the media were on their best behaviour. I'm usually a media knocker.
Sure.
I thought they were pretty good on this one. They treated it with contempt, like they should have, which was good. All I want to say about this is I found it strange, not just unedifying, but strange, how much people on social media were death-riding Trump, and in Colbert's audience, I might add as well.
Right.
I find it strange for a number of reasons. Like, I mean, firstly, let's leave aside the ghoulishness of it and the inhumanity of cheering for someone's death. Let's leave that aside. I get that Democrats hate Republicans, Republicans hate Democrats, America is split into. I understand. I've been watching this movie for a while. But what do those people think is going to happen if Trump dies? Do they think it's going to be good for them? Because let me tell you right now, it won't be good for them. J.D. Vance, if he takes over as president and he's running in 2028, he is going to spend the next 3 years desperately trying to win Trump's base over because they don't like him. They like Trump. And the way he's going to try and win Trump's base over is by being as Trumpy as he possibly can. So they'll have all the same negatives that they already have. The difference is they won't have the moments when Trump does something unorthodox and weird, because that's what Trump's like. He does something unpredictable sometimes. There'll be nothing unpredictable from J.D. Vance. He will just be like a robot, just churn out the Trumpiest possible move every single time, consistently. And unlike Trump, he won't stuff up. There won't be incompetence. These are the things that the Democrats profit from when Trump screws up. J.D. Vance is going to be ruthlessly efficient in executing maximum Trumpiness for 3 years. They are going to hate it if Trump dies. They should hope Trump doesn't die. So I don't know what's going on in their heads, leaving aside the humanity of it all.
Yeah, so there's a be careful what you wish for element to all of this. And there's also, this is a classic example of what the researchers say about why people spread fake news or misinformation, things that they know not to be true, because there is a bit of a thrill in kind of, there's something a little bit naughty and transgressive about even fantasising about something like this happening, which some Democrats would quite like to see happen. The big problem, of course, is it is a great example. Even though the media itself was not reporting this, Trump is now saying the media was reporting this and they're fake news. So to his supporters, it says, well, he's absolutely right. They now assume that MSNBC or CNN or ABC America were reporting that Trump was dead. They weren't, but Trump has effectively told them they were, and so they believe that. So this helps Trump not just when it comes to discrediting the media, but when the other big conspiracy theory that he is debunking right now is, of course, the Epstein files.
Yes.
So this helps him on that as well, because he's able to say, don't believe what you read, believe me. And the proof was in the pudding, or the proof was in the president. He was standing there saying, I'm not dead. They're wrong, I'm not dead. So it helps him.
Yeah, he's got to die more often.
It'll be very good for his career. So, OK, Donald Trump is not dead, but as the oldest person ever to take the presidential oath of office, questions about his health and fitness for office are not going to go away, nor indeed should they. Because we're not just talking about Trump here, but like over the years, several presidents have had very serious medical conditions which were concealed from the American public. Franklin Roosevelt had end-stage heart disease when he ran for re-election in 1944. They covered up the extent of his polio-related immobility, didn't show him in a wheelchair or tell people that he was so confined. Ronald Reagan and Joe Biden's apparent cognitive decline in their presidential terms. JFK had chronic back pain that meant he was on painkillers and speed. He had Addison's disease, all sorts of things. Both Eisenhower and Lyndon Johnson had a history of heart attacks. That was largely kept from the public. But none of those cases historically were as stark, nor indeed the cover-up as extreme, as that of President Woodrow Wilson. And arguably his illness also had the greatest impact on world affairs. Take a look. Woodrow Wilson was America's 28th president during the First World War. After playing a key role in negotiating the Treaty of Versailles to end the conflict, Wilson, a Democrat, returned to the United States in mid-1919 to discover growing political opposition to ratifying the treaty. He embarked on a whistle-stop tour to try and rally public support. It was after addressing a crowd in Pueblo, Colorado, that President Wilson suffered a severe headache, nausea, and uncontrollable twitching. Returning to Washington, D.C., he had a massive stroke. In those days before radio or TV, the extent of Wilson's illness wasn't that hard to hide from the public. He was paralysed down his left side, unable to walk, sign his name or even feed himself, although the White House convinced a distinguished surgeon, Dr Hugh Young, to issue a very different assessment.
The extreme vigour and lucidity of his mental processes had not abated in the slightest degree. He is in better shape than before the illness.
Wilson's personal physician, Carrie Grayson, was central to what became a major medical cover-up. He was summoned to a meeting of the Cabinet by Secretary of State Robert Lansing, who raised the prospect of Vice President Thomas Marshall taking over. Marshall said he could only assume the presidency if Grayson and First Lady Indepth Wilson declared that Woodrow Wilson was unfit and Congress passed a resolution. But Grayson denied the president was seriously incapacitated. Indepth Wilson feared if he resigns, the greatest incentive to recovery is gone. So instead, she demanded Secretary of State Lansing resign for calling the cabinet meeting, which he soon did. Some historians believe that Indepth Wilson then effectively became de facto president during her husband's final year and a half in office, when she communicated on his behalf, although she always denied she was anything but a wife, carer and gatekeeper. Still largely confined to his White House bedroom, Woodrow Wilson was unable to convince members of Congress to ratify the Versailles Treaty or join the League of Nations, which Wilson had hoped would prevent another war. The extent and duration of Wilson's illness was not only hidden from his cabinet, Congress and the American people, it was hidden from Wilson himself, who even wanted to run for a third term in 1920. Democrats wisely dismissed that idea. Based on the previously confidential papers of Dr. Grayson, neurologists now think that Wilson had experienced a series of strokes and what are now called transient ischemic attacks, dating back more than 20 years. Although even after his major illness in 1919, Wilson maintained he'd never had a stroke. Ironically, that is sometimes a symptom of strokes.
Denial of illness syndrome is characteristic of right parietal lobe damage.
And in recent years, experts have also noted the president's behaviour changed dramatically following a severe case of influenza during that 1919 pandemic that swept the world, suggesting that Wilson
grew more suspicious, secretive, and egocentric.
Potentially caused by
insufficient blood supply and impaired oxygenation of the brain.
They also suspect Wilson suffered yet another stroke while also battling the flu. Although growing more suspicious, secretive and egocentric can also be a symptom of the presidency itself. But either way, Woodrow Wilson was severely incapacitated, and it would be almost 50 years before the 25th Amendment tried to address the problem of what to do if a president is similarly unfit to serve but unwilling to resign. It now takes the Vice President and a majority of Cabinet or Congress to declare the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, whereupon the Vice President shall immediately assume the powers and duties of the office as acting President. Some have argued that Joe Biden's memory lapses should have seen him removed from the presidency last year. Others suggest that Donald Trump's illegal attempts to overturn the 2020 election warranted his removal under the 25th Amendment, but neither, of course, happened. Well, for more on the 25th Amendment, how it has been used, how it might be used in the future as well, potentially against President Trump, I spoke to Professor Kate Shaw, constitutional law expert based at the University of Pennsylvania, host of the Strict Scrutiny podcast and a former Obama White House legal counsel. Kate Shaw, welcome to Planet America's Situation Room. We've just been looking at the story of President Woodrow Wilson's incapacity in that final 18 months of his presidency. Did the subsequent passage of the 25th Amendment to the Constitution mean that an unwell president, unable to execute the powers of the office but unwilling to give up power, that problem has now been solved, or is there still a bit of a legal grey area?
Well, the 25th Amendment actually has a couple of different components. It has actually been used, the first section of the 25th Amendment, a number of times in totally uncontroversial ways. So that's the part that says the president can decide to temporarily transfer the powers and duties of the office to the vice president if the president knows that he's, say, undergoing a medical procedure that might temporarily incapacitate him. So that part has been used and used, well. I think the part that you're asking about is the fourth section of the 25th Amendment, the one that allows for essentially the involuntary removal of the president's power when initiated by the vice president and a majority of members of the cabinet. So that, provision, all of the 25th Amendment has been in place since 1967, and that section 4 has never been used. And so I don't know if we really know if it can work the way, it was intended, which is to allow for the kind of president, if the president is unable to actually perform the job, to be removed, whether or not the president realizes they are unable to perform the job. But it's totally untested.
And of course, Kate, since the passage of the 25th Amendment, we've seen at least two presidents, Ronald Reagan and Joe Biden, raise concerns about their cognitive decline in office. The 25th Amendment was not invoked in either case. In your view, in retrospect, should it have been?
I think it's pretty clearly the case that during the end of President Reagan's second term, or actually for much of his second term, there were real questions about his mental acuity and capacity, and staff did a great deal of work behind the scenes to shore up his ability to run the White House and the government. I think that there is less evidence that the kind of inability was as advanced with President Biden, but certainly there were issues toward the end of his term with his ability to actually, communicate effectively and perhaps to perform some aspects of the job. I actually don't know that it was a failure in either case. I don't think I would say that it was for the Section 4 mechanism not to have been used in those cases. I think that if there had been real deterioration beyond what actually transpired with respect to either president, perhaps each of the men's vice presidents might have initiated the procedure, but there is arguably a kind of design flaw in this part of the 25th Amendment, in that it is the vice president who has to initiate these proceedings to essentially have the president declared unfit. And of course, the vice president in our system is someone who has been handpicked by the president to be their second in command, and so will normally have a degree of loyalty to the president. Now, we'll have some self-interest too, so you could imagine potentially the mechanism allowing a kind of self-interested vice president to kind of align self-interest with national interest and to seek to remove, the president's powers from the president and to seize those powers for the vice president. But I guess that's a long way to say I don't think that it was wrong that the mechanism was not used in either previous case. And of course, we're having conversations now about whether that's something that there could be a need to invoke with respect to President Trump.
So you're the constitutional law expert. The Constitution says to be president, you need to be at least 35 years old and a natural-born citizen. But that's pretty much it. It doesn't go into a lot of detail about what makes somebody fit or not, competent or not, to be president, given that Joe Biden didn't get checked for a cancer that may end his life, that Donald Trump has literally written his own doctor's letters. I mean, is that good enough from a legal point of view?
Look, I think there's a very good argument that the public has a right to more information about presidential health and fitness, including, of course, sort of mental capacity. And I don't think it's something that would be beyond the ability of Congress to legislate, but we have seen, nothing of the sort happen so far. It's really been just tradition that presidents have released basically annually their kind of doctor's reports. And as you say, there's no kind of check to ensure that those reports are kind of accurate and sound. But I think it might be useful to have some kind of outside mechanism that would allow the public to feel secure in their knowledge of the president's capacity. In some ways, implicitly, what the 25th Amendment, which you're right, of course, about the requirements in the original Constitution to serve as president, but arguably the 25th Amendment, which gets added in 1967, adds adds, an additional explicit requirement that had always been implicit, but that the president was able to perform and discharge the duties of the office because it sets forth a procedure for essentially unseating the president if the president is no longer unable. The word in the Section 4 of the 25th Amendment is if the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office. And so I guess by implication, the president has to be able to do the job constitutionally.
And Kate, on that question of being able to do the job, there was talk in Trump's first term a couple of times, reportedly, about using the 25th to remove him, particularly after the January 6th attacks. But of course, they were talking about his actions in office and his temperament, his fitness, rather than any sort of incapacity. Is that what it's designed to do? Could it have been used in that way?
It's one of these rare constitutional amendments where we actually do have a degree of access to the intent of the framers, right? Of course, we're mostly just looking at, kind of dusty documents to try to discern the intent of the framers of the original Constitution. But 1967 is not that long ago. And I think it's right that the individuals, congressional staffers who were involved in the drafting of the 25th Amendment would say that kind of medical inability is really the thing that was front of mind in the crafting of the 25th Amendment, and in particular, this part of it. So say, right, if someone is either in deep decline and in denial about their deep decline, or potentially if there is a kind of, an actual stroke that leaves a president, say, comatose, they're not going to be able to voluntarily transfer power under the first provision of the 25th Amendment. And this allows a mechanism for the transfer to happen. Because if the president is living prior to the 25th Amendment, it's not clear who has the power of the office, even if the president is actually unconscious or non-responsive, say. So I do think that the intent was very much about kind of medical incapacity. And yet, the language just says unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office. So I think there is an absolutely non-frivolous argument that serious enough misconduct that is antithetic to the structure of the Constitution and the basic obligation of the president to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, that's a kind of inability that does, I think, fall within the basic scope of this provision of the Constitution. So I don't think it's an argument that has no weight whatsoever. And I do think that those conversations with whatever degree of seriousness, I don't know, but that those conversations did occur inside the executive branch and the president's cabinet after January 6th. Obviously, there was, nothing got far enough along to actually see the invocation of the 25th Amendment. But there's a slightly complex procedural dance that's in the amendment if the president objects. So basically, if the vice president and a majority of the cabinet decide that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office, they can essentially, through that majority vote, temporarily transfer the powers of the presidency to the vice president. But if the president objects and says, yes, I am able, then actually the matter goes to Congress and Congress decides. So there's like a complicated calculation that has to occur between the vice president and the cabinet to ensure that they're likely to prevail if they're going to try to invoke the 25th Amendment in a context in which the president will object. And only if they think they can get a 2/3 vote in each House of Congress, which is what is required, will, I think, they decide it is prudent to invoke this part of the amendment.
Kate Shaw, thank you for joining us on Planet America.
Thank you, John.
Better news for Trump than dying, but only just. He suffered a big loss in court this week in the world of tariffs. And that is that the DC Appeals Court held 7-4 that Trump's Liberation Day tariffs were unlawful. Trump's already appealed to the Supreme Court, so we're going to see what happens there. But the logic he's been running with in court isn't really a legal argument. It's more that if the tariffs are blocked, it will be a disaster. First, his team submitted to the appeals court that an end to the tariffs could lead to a 1929 Great Depression-style result, and that people would be forced from their homes, millions of jobs would be lost, and Social Security and Medicare would be threatened. Then when that didn't convince the court, the administration raised the stakes further, with Trump writing that if this decision's allowed to stand, it would literally destroy the United States of America. He's also putting out tweets suggesting that the tariffs have already raised $8 trillion in tariff revenue and create hundreds of thousands of new jobs. For the record, the tariffs have actually raised $96 billion in revenue so far, and there have only been 600,000 jobs in total created in the entire year, full stop, compared to almost 1.1 million jobs created during the same period last year. So Trump's been ridiculous. But it's not like there are no benefits to the tariffs. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said, for instance, that customs duty revenues from the tariffs are higher than expected. He says they're looking at more than $300 billion in takings for the year and might eventually top out over $500 billion a year. So could Americans miss those tariffs when they're gone? Time to ask an economist. So I spoke to the Director of Economic Policy at the American Enterprise Institute, Michael Strain. Michael Strain, welcome to Planet America. Now, Trump says that ending the tariffs would literally destroy the United States of America, and it would make America a third world country. Now, I know that's not literally true, but would a sudden end to the tariffs create some issues at least?
A sudden end to the tariffs would create some issues. I think primarily in the bond market. Bond investors have, I think, come to the view that at least over the next few years, tariff revenue is going to be a permanent feature of the United States. And if the president were to choose not to replace the revenue that the U.S. is currently getting from the tariffs with another source, then that would increase the U.S.'s budget deficit. And that would make bond investors, a little more skittish than I think they currently are. At the same time, I think if the tariffs were to be shelved, that would increase the near-term outlook for economic growth in the United States. It would reduce expected inflation in the United States as well, and so. I think on balance and over the course of several months, markets would likely come to the view that that the end of the tariffs is a good thing for the United States, even though I think there might be some shock at first.
Michael, do you agree that the tariffs are looking like they could raise over $300 billion a year, which is what's been speculated? And if so, that's a lot of money to deprive America of, isn't it? Wouldn't ending the tariffs hurt the deficit?
Yeah, it really depends, I think, on the time horizon you're talking about. So I do think the U.S. is on track to raise over $300 billion in tariff revenue in 2025. I don't think it's as simple, though, as multiplying that number by 10 in order to come up with a 10-year revenue figure. And that's because if tariffs really do become a permanent feature of U.S. economic policy, then households and businesses are likely to substitute away from imported goods. And that means there'll be fewer goods to tax. And that means that tariff revenue will drop over time. And so, I still think it's hard to figure out with any precision what the kind of longer term revenue impact of the tariffs will be. But certainly, I think this year and next year, annual revenues above $300 billion is a very reasonable estimate. And, that's real money. And losing that revenue would increase the deficit.
Trump's spoken about literally trillions of dollars of investments being tied to the tariffs. Now, we saw a lot of promises of investments from Europe and Japan, for instance. Do you think those investments would eventuate? And if the tariffs end, that could undermine those promises?
I don't think that the tariffs ending would have a big effect on those promises. I think a lot of what's been promised to President Trump are investments that likely would have happened anyway. And they're investments that make economic sense for the businesses in the nations you mentioned. And so I think we would see most of that activity continue to go forward.
What proportion of the tariffs that are in legal jeopardy, in your view, could be reimagined as new tariffs under different statutory authorizations?
I think that what we're going to see is the White House try to retain basically all of the tariffs that President Trump has put in place, even if the Supreme Court rules that the specific law he used to put them in place was used inappropriately. Now that's going to again result in some legal challenges, and the Supreme Court's going to have to decide the issue a second time. I think the right expectation for markets and for businesses is that those tariffs, on the whole, by and large, aren't really going to go away, regardless of what the Supreme Court rules.
Right. Michael, if tariffs are so bad, why do you think the Biden administration didn't get rid of Trump's first-term tariffs?
President Trump's first-term tariffs are a lot different than his second-term tariffs. His first-term tariffs were largely concentrated on China. There were some tariffs put in place on U.S. allies, but those were watered down, removed, put on hold for the most part. I think what happened was that inside the Biden White House, the national security community made the argument that kind of unilaterally reducing U.S. tariff rates on Chinese imports would be a major strategic concession to China. And it would have been good for the U.S. economy, but that in a geostrategic sense, the U.S. really needed to get something out of that. There needed to be a trade that was made, and the Biden administration wasn't able to come up with something they thought that China would give the U.S. where it would make sense to reduce those tariff rates. That illustrates, I think, the complexity of tariffs on Chinese imports, because there's an economic component to it, to be sure, but there's also the security, these serious security concerns, and more broadly, these geostrategic, geopolitical concerns. That is not true for the majority of the tariffs President Trump has imposed in his second term. U.S. security is reduced, not strengthened. The U.S.'s geopolitical goals are weakened, not enhanced, when the U.S. puts tariffs on major allies like Australia, like Japan, like the United Kingdom, like Canada, and like Europe. And so I think that's an important difference.
Finally, are there any benefits to these tariffs that we're not considering that we might miss when they're gone?
No, I think the benefit to the U.S. from the tariffs is the tax revenue. But the tariffs will weaken the U.S. manufacturing sector. The tariffs will reduce U.S. manufacturing employment. The tariffs will increase consumer prices. The tariffs will reduce the real incomes of American households. The tariffs will slow overall economic activity. The tariffs will weaken the U.S. labor market. So there really is no upside to the tariffs in an economic sense, except for the tax revenue. Now, the U.S. has a massive budget deficit, and the U.S. needs to increase tax revenue. And so more tax revenue is good. The question is, I think, can we raise the tax revenue we need in a way that's less economically harmful than what we're seeing through these tariffs? And the answer to that question, in my judgment, is clearly yes. So I would welcome the tariffs being eliminated that President Trump has put in place, even though that would come at the cost of losing some tax revenue.
Michael Strain, thanks for visiting Planet America.
Thanks so much for having me back.
And that is all for another trip to Planet America. Join us again on Monday night, 9:35 p.m. right after Media Watch on ABC TV. You'll also find us on ABC iView, YouTube and Facebook.
We're going to have another weekend edition at the same time next Friday on ABC News. And don't forget the PED podcast as well and all the usual pod places. See you there.
Bye-bye.